everybody. Everybody's doing well. Well, what I'm going to do is go over on this video the skull. Okay, it's the skull here with the mandible. All right, and I'm going to go over the skull. I'm going to first go over the major bones of the skull, and then I'll get into the different landmarks that are within each bone, and then I'll also go over these sutures here, and then finally I'll go over this fetal skull. Okay, all right, so let's start with the skull here. Okay, the skull is made up of 8 cranial bones, okay, and made up of 14 facial bones. All right, so let's start naming some of just the major bones, and then from there we'll do the sutures, and then we'll go over the individual parts. Okay, so up here we have the frontal bone, and you can see these sutures here will mark as a boundary between adjacent bones. Okay, so here we have the frontal bone. On the sides here, frontal bone. On the sides we have the parietal bone. Good to know where it is in your own skull. In the back here you have the occipital bone in the back. Okay. On the sides here we have the temporal bone. Okay. On each side. All right. These are the most toughest ones to try to understand. But here you have a sphenoid bone. You can see the suture here marking the boundary of the sphenoid bone. It kind of looks like a bat or a Pegasus, of course with wings. So that's the sphenoid bone. And in here you have the ethmoid bone, which of course you're looking at the superior view of the skull. Okay. And we have the ethmoid, and it descends halfway down your nose. So, and it's kind of like a tiny little box between your eyes. That is where the ethmoid bone will be located. Okay, we have our cheekbones here, which are our zygomatic bones. Okay. We have the nasal bone, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure, I didn't mention that. Nasal bone. Here you have the lacrimal bone. Okay. Lacrimal bone. Here where your mustache is and the side of your nose is called the maxillary bone, or the maxilla. Here you have the vomer, little pointy, a little point right there. Vomer. And in the bottom here you have the inferior nasal concha. Inferior nasal concha, which is its own separate bone. You have the middle and superior nasal concha, but it's part of the ethmoid bone. So we're just doing the individual bones, so superior, inferior nasal concha. And one more here, you have the mandible. Okay. All right. So those are the major bones. You should really know those bones. So let's start getting into the landmarks in each bone. Now, some of the bones won't have landmarks. Just think of the bones being like the state, and the cities within the state will be like the landmarks. So the state will be the individual bones, and each one will have individual landmarks. Let's go over these sutures really quick, because these sutures act like a line of demarcation between adjacent bones. So this is the front. This suture here is going to be called the coronal suture. Like putting a corona or crown on your head. Corona, not the Corona beer. The corona meaning crown. Okay, so that's the coronal suture. Here we have the sagittal suture, okay, which separates the skull into left and right halves. And then back here we have lambdoidal suture. Lambdoidal suture separates the parietal from the occipital. And here we have the squamosal suture, which separates the parietal from the temple. So you should know those 4 sutures. There's other sutures throughout the skull, but those are the 4 most popular ones. Okay, so now we did the major bones, we did the sutures. Now let's go into the individual landmarks of each bone. Frontal, nothing going on there. Parietal, nothing going on there. Let's go to occipital bone. Okay, you should probably know here. This is called the external occipital protuberance, that little bump in the back of your head. Okay. Down here, you're going to have the foramen magnum, which is the largest hole in our skull. Foramen means hole, and magnum means large, so it's a large hole. Okay, on either side here of the foramen magnum, you have these little bumps here. Okay, those are called the occipital condyles, and the occipital condyles sit on top of the atlas and allow you to say yes. Okay. All right, another structure that's part of the occipital bone, I would say the hypoglossal canal here, the hypoglossal nerve. And then one more thing, you have the jugular foramen, which is right here. Jugular foramen. And let's not focus on that. Jugular foramen, which is the second largest hole in our skull. That's the jugular foramen. Alright, so those four things make up the occipital bone, the most popular terms: external occipital protuberance, foramen magnum, occipital condyles, hypoglossal canal, and actually 5 with the jugular foramen. Okay, so let's go next to the temporal bone. Okay, so this is our temporal bone right here. Okay, the temporal bone is going to be made up of several structures here. Probably the most structures out of any of the bones that I will mention. Here you have this little bump right here. That's called the mastoid process. That's what girls like to put perfume back here. Okay, so mastoid process, you feel a little bump back there. All right, then you have this one here, little stick-looking thing right here. Okay, that's called the styloid process, stick styloid. All right, so those two structures. For the temporal, you have this hole right here, which is called the external auditory canal or external acoustic meatus. Okay, there's several ways you can name that. A couple ways, at least. Okay, here you have this little depression here, which is part of the temporal. It's called the mandibular fossa, here and here. And the mandibular fossa articulates with the mandibular condyles of the mandible. Allows it to hinge, allows the mandible to hinge. Okay, so you can open and close your mouth. Okay. All right, so we have the mastoid process, styloid process, the mandibular fossa, external auditory canal. All right, anything else? We can name this too if you want. This is the squamous region. It's the flat part of the skull. Okay, squamous region. Okay, so we got the squamous region, and inside here we have the petrous region. Kind of looks like a mountain. Petrous, like the petrous region. Just think of petrous meaning like rocky, piedra, rocky. It's like a rocky mountain. And that petrous region is going to enclose the inner ear. Okay. Also here you have the internal auditory canal. That's where the vestibulocochlear nerve comes out of the inner ear, so it can process balance and equilibrium. Okay. Okay, you see this yellow line here for the suture? Okay, that's going to separate the temporal from the zygomatic. Well, this part on the temporal is going to be called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, because here neighboring it is going to be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So the temporal process and the zygomatic process both make up the zygomatic arc. Okay. All right, so I thought I'd mention the zygomatic bone there. And there's really nothing more that we have to talk about zygomatic bone except for it being the cheekbone. All right, so we did the temporal and we just did zygomatic. All right, so let's go down now into the sphenoid bone. Okay, the sphenoid bone is this bat-shaped structure here. And it kind of resembles a Pegasus, a horse with wings, because this in the middle here is called a sella turcica, or translated is Turkish saddle. Okay, so just think of the saddle being on the back of the horse of that Pegasus. And what sits inside that sella turcica is going to be the pituitary gland, or the hypophysis, a major gland. Okay. So we have the sphenoid bone, we have the sella turcica. The little depression is called there's a little depression here. That's the hypophyseal fossa, which is part of the sella turcica. You have the anterior clinoid processes, which is kind of like the reins, which the knight, in this case the hypophysis, is steering that horse. All right, you get a bunch of holes here that are part of the sphenoid. You may or may not have to know them, but let's try to keep it like right there so you can see them all. Okay, so here we have the foramen lacerum, which is on either side of the sella turcica. Then here just think of ROS, R-O-S, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. Okay, so foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum, ROS, and then you have foramen lacerum. Okay, and here you're going to have the optic canals, okay, for the optic nerve, optic canal. Some more holes associated with the sphenoid bone. Okay, and then also what's left here for the sphenoid bone, we have the greater wings of sphenoid. These are the greater wings, and these are the lesser wings of sphenoid. Greater wings and lesser wings of sphenoid. All right, so those are all the components of the sphenoid bone. All right, let's go to the ethmoid bone. This little ethmoid bone is a little bone between your eyes. It looks like a little box. And on the top of the ethmoid bone here, we're going to have the crista galli. Crista galli looks like the rooster's comb. That little, it looks like it's hair, but it's actually skin that's on the top of its head. So that's called the crista galli, the crest of the gallo, or the crest of the rooster. Now, on either side of the crista galli, on the top of this ethmoid bone here, you can see the ethmoid bone bounded by this yellow suture. But on either side of the crista galli, you're going to have these perforations for the olfactory nerves, and that's called the cribriform plate. So you have the crista galli, and we have the cribriform plate on the superior side of the ethmoid bone. And as we go down the ethmoid bone, here you're going to see the ethmoid bone medially in the orbit. So we can say that's the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. This whole thing is the orbital plate, which is made up, the socket, the eye socket is made up of a bunch of different bones. So you just say orbital plate of that particular bone. So this is the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone, the orbital plate of the frontal bone, the orbital plate of the zygomatic bone, the orbital plate of the maxillary bone. Okay, as we go down the ethmoid, here you're going to see the middle nasal concus, which has the same function as the inferior nasal concha. However, the middle nasal concha is part of the ethmoid bone, while the inferior nasal concha is not. And also part of the ethmoid bone will be the superior nasal concha. So middle and superior nasal concha make up the ethmoid bone. The crista galli, the cribriform plate, crista galli, cribriform plate, the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone, the middle nasal concha, and superior nasal concha. Oh, and also the perpendicular plate. The perpendicular plate is a plate of bone, a wall of bone that separates the nasal cavity into left and right halves. Almost forgot perpendicular plate. Oh, okay. All right, so that's the end of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so we did all the major bones and their structures. Oh, we got the maxilla. Nothing really much going on there, except that you do have an alveolar margin or an alveolar process of the maxilla. And the alveolar margin and the alveolar process is just sockets for the teeth to fit inside. Okay? So the alveolar margin of the maxilla, because there's going to be an alveolar margin for the mandible. All right, I believe that's it for the skull. All the different components of the skull there. All right. Yeah, that's it. So let's go down to the mandible. Okay. So the mandible, you're going to have here the mental foramen, which are these holes. If you can see it, little hole right there, mental foramen. And then also you have these holes back here, which are the mandibular foramen. Mandibular foramen. And those holes allow nerves to go through it. And usually when you go to the dentist, they inject around that nerve and it numbs that area. So if they work on your wisdom tooth in the back, they'll probably inject around the nerves that come out of here. And if they work on your teeth in the front, they'll inject nerves around the nerves that come out of the mental foramen. Okay, and then over here you're going to have the alveolar process, or the alveolar margin of the mandible. Now the bone is removed from this. You can actually see the root of the tooth down here, and that sits within that little socket called the alveolar margin. All right, and then back here you have the mandibular condyles or condylar processes, and that articulates with the mandibular fossa. Okay. And then finally here we have the coronoid process, which is directly in front of the mandibular condyles. So coronoid process. Okay. So that's pretty much it for the skull and all the bones that are associated with it and the sutures. Okay. And all we got left here is just to talk about the little fetus here, fetal skull. Now, it's important to note that the bones have not fused together completely in the fetus and in the newborn. Okay. There's still some cartilage that's left over that needs to be converted to eventually sutures and bone and then sutures. So that's why this is a little soft spot in the skull, the fetal skull. Okay, there's no bone there, so you got to be very careful with the babies up here, newborns. All right, so let's start naming some these soft spots. They're called fontanelles. Okay, and there's 4 fontanelles you need to know. That's all we're going to discuss on this. Here you have the anterior fontanelle. Okay, the front. Here you have in the back the posterior fontanelle. Okay. All right, here in the front here you're going to have the sphenoidal fontanelle, or anterolateral fontanelle. And then here you have the mastoid fontanelle in the back here, where the mastoid process will be, or posterolateral fontanelle. So those are the 4 major fontanelles of the fetal skull. Okay. All right, so that's it for the, hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the skull. That's all I have for the skull. Okay, take care, good luck, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.